Today's shiur is Nazir Daf Vav. Before we begin the shiur, before we even begin our textual introductory remarks, let us point out, since we are learning within a Daf Yomi framework, today's shiur is, of course, Daf Vav. We will be beginning the second line from the bottom of Daf Chav Hey Amid Beis, and it might very well be that today's shiur for Daf Chav Vav will continue until Daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis, so that in Mitzvah Hashem our shiur for Daf Chav Zayin will then begin on Chav Zayin Amid Beis, the second line from the top. So as far as people who are keeping careful records and keeping to a very strict Daf Yomi type study, that is what we have to say. Before we go into the Gemara text itself, in the margin of our marked Gemara, Daf Chav Hey Amid Beis, we have a topic heading. Hayim Hadi Omar Rav Yochanan Liel Reish Amid Aleph. Is it so regarding that which Rabbi Yochanan had said at the upper part of Daf Chav Hey Amid Aleph Halachu b'Nazir, that when you have monies that were set aside by a Nazir for the purchase of his sacrifices, and the monies were not defined, the oral tradition says that even though there is chatos money mixed in, because a Nazir has to bring, in addition to the shlomim and ola offering, he also brings a chatos offering, Rabbi Yochanan said that, well, there's an oral tradition that it is used to buy nedavas, olah sacrifices. That the most stumin, the undefined Nazir monies, the oral tradition says, if the monies are not necessary anymore, even though there's chatos money mixed in, but since the monies were not earmarked, they weren't specified, the oral tradition says they are used for a nedavar purchase. So the question here is, Havi Rak ben Nazir, is that concept, that law, limited to Nazir? Or sheyesh mikrim noisofim shafalpisha tmechatz murav b'mois b'chilzois yiplu l'nedavar. Are there other cases where even though you have chatos monies mixed in, nevertheless the monies are used for nedava purchases? The Gemara, again, second line from the bottom on Chav Hey Amid Beis. Omar Mar halacha hi benazir. We heard Rabbi Yochanan say that most stumin are yiplu l'nedava as an oral tradition. The Gemara asks v'su leka, by Rabbi Yochanan saying it's an oral tradition by Nazir, it leaves room for thinking that maybe it's only by Nazir, not by other cases, other topics. Is that really so? V'ha Tanya. We have the following Tanaic source that continues to the third line from the top of Chav Vav and Aleph. It says, Ushar chayvei kinin shebetorah, other bird offerings. These are in the context of sacrifices whose owner cannot afford to bring an animal offering. So in certain cases, the Torah makes a provision for him to buy birds instead. And they're called kinin. 2 birds are brought. The other chayvei kinin shebetorah, the Gemara continues at the top of Chav Vav Amud Aleph, shefrishu mois lekinehem. They set aside money for the purchase of their bird offerings. An example would be, as Rashi cites, a mitzora, a person who was a mitzora, who suffered from tzoras, and he can't afford to bring the animal offering, so there's a provision in the Torah for him to bring a bird offering. The bird offering is made up of 2 birds, a chatos bird and an olah bird. So, in a case like that, they set aside money for their birds. Rotza lahavi bohen chatos behema yavi, olas behema yavi. If after he set aside his the monies for his bird offerings, the man became wealthy and he could afford animal offerings, so he can use the bird monies. Of course, he'll have to add to it to buy a chatos, to buy an olah, These are mitzora required sacrifices. Meis v'hoyu lo moi stumin. If the mitzora died and he had undefined monies, it says yiplu l'nedava. The monies are used for buying olah sacrifices. Now, here you've got the undefined monies of a mitzora that died. Is it not so that there's chatos money, potential chatos money mixed in? Did we not say that the mitzora has to bring a chatos and an olah? So what do we see? Here, this has nothing to do with Nazir, and yet you have a case of chatos monies mixed in, being that the monies were not specified. These are for one and these are for the other. These monies are for the chatos, these monies are for the olah. They're undefined monies coming from a person that had a chatos requirement, and it says yiplu l'nedava. So that our question is, why did Rav Yochanan give us the sense that it's a halacha by Nazir that mo'os stumin yiplu l'nedava, when you have here a case of mo'os stumin that's not Nazir related, that's also yiplu l'nedava? The Gemara responds, Tana Nazir. The Tana had taught the case of Nazir, meaning when Rabbi Yochanan said halachu b'Nazir, he didn't intend his remarks to be taken as only by a Nazir, but rather a Nazir v'chayve kinin dedamu lei, and other cases of people who are chayav, who are obligated to bring kinin, bird sacrifices, that are similar, just like a Nazir has a chatos and an olah requirement. When someone has a bird requirement, if that individual is similar to a Nazir in the sense that he is obligated to bringing those, the same law will apply. If the monies were not yet defined and they became unnecessary, the owner died, so they are yiplu l'nedava. Ulafuke meha desanya. And this idea of Nazir and anyone similar to Nazir is to the exclusion of the following. We have a Tanaic source. Before we read the Tanaic source, let's learn the Rashi simply as introduction to the Gemara. We'll then go over the Gemara after the Rashi. The Rashi that we're looking at is across from here, fourth narrow line, afuke meha desanya, and to the exclusion of that which is taught in the following, mishahaya mechuyev chatos, ve'omar harei olai oilas nedava, a man that had a chatos sin offering obligation upon him, and he also said, I want to bring an olah voluntary offering, olas nedava. Now, at this point, you have a person obligated in two sacrifices. He had a sin offering, a previous requirement for bringing a sin offering, and he also obligates himself on a voluntary basis to bring an olah. V'hifrish mois, and he set aside money, v'omar elu l'chovasi, and he says, these are for my obligation. Rotza lahavi bohen chatos behema lo yavi. If he wants to use those monies to buy a chatos behema, he cannot do so. L'fishiesh lomar shemos shem olo chalalehem. You can't use them as for your chatos because maybe the olah status is upon them. Ulovi oilas behema yev sho shem l'shem chatos ifrish oison hamois v'les lehu takanta. And alternatively as well, to use those monies in the illustration we just gave, where he said Elu l'chovasi, to use them for an olah, that he can't do either, because maybe the chatos status is upon them, and in a case like that, he would have no solution. The komash malon, and what we meant when we said Tona Nazir and anyone similar to the Nazir, Dahachi hu gabi Nazir v'dadami lei techayev b'chatos u'ba'olah b'bas achas, where you have someone who became obligated in a chatos and olah simultaneously. As the example, a Nazir, when he concludes his Nazirus, he has an equal, simultaneous chatos olah requirement. A mitzora has a chatos olah requirement simultaneously. In a case like that, we say that the monies, if they're not needed anymore, the owner died, the monies are used for nedava. Avol kol hecha delo nischayev b'chatas v'oila al ma'aseh echad, but cases where the obligation did not set in simultaneously because of one incident, as we saw before, someone who had a chatas only requirement, and then he subsequently obligated himself to bring an olah. Lo amrinan hachi elo yechu liyam hamelach. In a case like that, where the monies were not necessary, the owner died, the undefined monies will go to the Dead Sea because of the presence of the chatas monies that are mixed in. So you see a contrast. You have two situations where you have mol stumin, and there's the chatas potential mixed in there. If the obligation for both sacrifices, the olah and the chatas, set in simultaneously, then when the monies are not necessary, we say yiplu linadava. If the two sacrifices did not become obligatory simultaneously, then if the monies are not needed and you have the chatas monies mixed in there, we say yechu leyam hamelach, not linadava. So now we go back to our Gemara text, and we said that when we said before that Nazir and anything similar to Nazir, the most stumin yiplu linadava lafuke mehadesanya mi shahaya mechuyev chatas, someone who had originally been obligated to bring a chatas sacrifice. The Omar, and that person said, Harei olai oila, I am accepting upon myself as well to bring a voluntary olah offering. V'frishmois v'Omar, and he set aside money and he declared, Harei elu l'chovasi. And he said, I want these monies to be used for my chova. What's my chova? That which I'm obligated to bring. Well, truth is he's obligated to bring a chatas, and he's also obligated to bring an olah. He imposed upon himself an olah obligation. Well, in a case like this, if he labeled the monies, as we said, Harei elu l'chovasi, well, Ratzalavi bohen chatos behema lo yavi. If he plans to use those monies to buy a chatos animal offering, he won't be able to do that because there might be an olah status attached to them. The word chovasi that he said, Harei elu l'chovasi, says these are for my obligation. So to bring a chatos behema with them, he wouldn't be able to do that. Oilas behema lo yavi. Likewise, if he were to use those monies to buy an olah, he wouldn't be able to do that either because there's chatos monies there's a chatos status upon those monies also. Meis v'hoyu lomo stumin, if the individual who had been chayav chatos and accepted upon himself an olah obligation, if he dies and he had undefined monies, yechu liyam hamelach, the monies are to be deposited in the Dead Sea, in the Salt Sea, where they will decompose. And as we said, this source is in contrast to the case of the Nazir, because in this source, the two obligations, the chatas and olah obligations, did not set in simultaneously. Before we continue in the Gemara text, we glance at the side. We have a nosei / mivneh heading, the topic heading combined with a structural note. We feature a house shape. You'll see in the Gemara itself such a marking. And we also have Roman numerals 1 and 2. These represent Shnei Lashonos, two versions, Baravashi, Ma Hagdora Shomois Mefurashin. What do we mean when we say specified or earmarked monies? We've been speaking along the way already for quite a while about Mos Stumin versus Mos Mefurashin. Stumin, we said, were undefined monies, and specific halachas apply to that case. And in contrast, Mos Mefurashin, earmarked monies, where different halachas apply to them. So what do we mean by those terms, though? So now the Gemara text. You'll notice, by the way, a double underlining that highlights the expression mefurashin. I think we can say with a degree of certainty that, however we define mefurashin, that which is not stated then would constitute stumin. In other words, we're giving now the guidelines for mufuroshin. Anything that's less specific would then fall under the category of undefined. If that sounds a little abstract, we'll understand it better by seeing examples. So the Gemara, Omar Rav Ashi, the first house marking you see, Ha diamris mefurashin lo, that which we've said that if the monies were specified, they are not going to be nidava. Lo tema diamar, don't think to say it's only where he was very specific. He had a pile of money, and he then divided the pile into three parts, where he says, Elu lechatasi, v'elu lo'losi, v'elu l'shalmi. A Nazir has a tri-sacrificial obligation, chatas, ola, and shlomim. So our Gemara here, Rav Ashi, in this version is saying that earmarking or specificity isn't where it's that specific, where you've divided the monies into three separate piles. Even if you had one pile of money and you said Elu lechatasi lo'losi l'shlami mefurashin hein. Even if you had the monies and you said these are for my chatas, ola, and shlomim, that's also considered mifurash. It's also considered specified. Of course, then if you had said, for example, Elu lechovasi, these are for my obligation, you didn't even mention the specific kinds of sacrifices, that would be called stumin, undefined. Even though you limited the monies in a certain sense to that which you're obligated to bring as opposed to voluntary offerings, nevertheless, you didn't specify the names of the sacrifices. Let's continue in the Gemara. V'ika diamri, another version. Amar Rav Ashi, lo tema, don't suggest that mefurashin is only if he says, Adi Omar elu lechatasi uloilasi l'shlami, elo afilu Omar elu lechayvasi harei hein k'mefurashin. Even if all he said, these are for my chova, they are considered nevertheless as specified. If you look in the Rashi, you will see also he elaborates on this, but I think that for our purposes we will be able to continue in the Gemara. Omar Rava. On the side we have a topic heading, Dinoi Shel Rava. Rava's law. Most stumin shenifrad mehem shiur demei chatos. He had undefined monies. Again, at this point then, however you define the undefined, boy, that sounds a little confusing, but given a pile of unspecified or non-earmarked monies, and there became separated from those monies shiur demei chatos, the amount of money that would have been suitable for the purchase of a chatos. When you have a pile of undefined money, you realize that the money is what was to be used for a chatos, ola, and shlomim. The chatos, it represents that which is, we'll say, the most maybe problematic aspect of it, because when you have chatos monies that you don't need, they would be sent to the Yam HaMelach when they're part of a mixture. So we already saw that you have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that the monies are used for nidava, which means for ola purchases. Now the issue is they became separated from the monies the amount that would have been suitable for buying the chatos offering. Hamosh nisharu lo yiplu l'nidava elodinam kemefurashin. We say then that the remaining monies don't go linidava. The idea of going linidava, being used for the purchase of ola sacrifices, is only when the chatos monies were still mixed in. But if the amount of money suitable for the purchase of a chatos fell away, the remaining monies are then viewed as if they were specified for ola and for shlomim, and you would buy with those monies ola and shlomim sacrifices. Now the Gemara. Omar Rava, 3 lines from the bottom of Chof Amud Aleph. Hadi Amoran, most stumin yiplu l'nidava, that which we have said till now, that the undefined monies are used collectively for the purchase of nidava, of ola sacrifices. Im nofla demei chatos mi beinehen harehein kemefurashin. If there became separated from them, from amongst those monies, the amount of money fit for buying a chatos, we don't say that the balance is used for nidava, but rather the balance is used for buying with half of them ola and with half of the money shlomim. And we might as well add, we're dealing with someone with monies that were originally to be used for a Nazir. In the case of the purchase of the shlomim that we just mentioned, the accompanying loaves of bread will not take place, because once again we're dealing with someone who's not around anymore. The Nazirus is no longer around, so the loaves would not be brought. The loaves are 20 in number that are part of a real Nazir's shlomim sacrifice. Here, though, we're dealing with a lapsed Nazirus. Either the owner died or the woman's vow had been absolved. We continue at the top of Amid Beis. Tanya Kavose de Rava. Let's take a look before we go further in reading this source. We look at the Rashi on the top. Tanya Kavose de Rava Elu Lechatosi Vashar Lishar Nazirusi Es Hashar Yavi Chetzio Leola V'Chetzio L'Shlomim. You have someone that said, these monies are for my chatos, and the rest is for my Nazirus obligations, namely Ola and Shlomim. The Kevan the Omar, and what's the result, by the way? We say that the monies that he said for my Nazirus, he will bring with half of them an Ola and half of them Shlomim. The Kevan the Omar Elu Lechatasi, since he defined some of the monies as being specifically for the chatos purchase, kemi she'avdu dami, or kemi she'nifredu dami. It's as if they are lost, or it's as if they became separated. Bashar havi lehu kemifurashin, and the balance is like defined monies used for their specific purposes. Even though it's a pile of money containing enough to buy an Ola and Shlomim, it's considered as if it's been specified, part for Ola and part for the Shlomim. The Tosfos at the top points out that what we're going to be learning about in this source is talking about an owner that died, and there's some girsos, some versions have the issue of death specified. Now the Gemara. We say we have a Tanaic source supporting Rava's din, and it reads, Elu l'chatosi, a person said that regarding some of the monies, and he specified part of the pile of money for the chatos, v'sha'ar l'sha'ar nazirusi, and the rest of the monies are for his other nazirus sacrifices. What he might very well have done is pushed aside some of the monies and said these are for the chatos, and the other monies that remained in their original spot, he said these are for my nazirus requirements. And then the man died. The monies that he specified for the chatos, those monies are sent to the Dead Sea where they will decompose. Vashar, the balance of the monies, Yavi chetzio liola v'chetzio l'shlomim. Part will be brought as an ola and part as shlomim. Umoyalin bekulan v'ein moyalin b'miktsasan. If he were to take the ola and shlomim pile of money and use all of the monies for personal purposes, he would be guilty of mi'ilah. Mi'ilah is the name of the sin which prohibits personal benefit from something that has been sanctified. But here we have to be careful. When we speak about something been sanctified, that applies when you impose upon the item kodshe kodshim sanctity. When dealing with sacrifices, you have two levels of sanctity. Kodshe kodshim, kodshim kalim. Kodshim kalim, like a shlomim, the lower level sanctity, though one is prohibited to use it for personal purposes, it nevertheless does not result in the mi'ilah sin. The mi'ilah sin is not just the prohibition of benefiting from it, but it states that if you do benefit from it, so you have to compensate the Beis HaMikdash and you also have to bring a separate korban, an osha mi'ilos, for having sinned thusly. That applies once again to the personal benefit derived from something with kodshe kodshim status, like an olah, but something that has kodshim kalim status, like a shlomim, so mi'ilah doesn't apply, and therefore the pile of money that remained, that would have been used for the purchase of olah and shlomim, if you used all of the monies for personal benefit, so you have definitely violated Me'ilah. However, if you used only part of the monies for personal benefit, we can say that, well, those monies would have been used for the shlomim purchase, and shlomim doesn't have a Me'ilah sin attached to them. Let's continue in the source. Elu lo losi vashar l'shar nezirusi. If he specified that some of the monies, and he specified them for olah purposes, and he said the rest of the monies for my other nazirus requirements, and then the owner died, demei olah yaviu olah umalim, and the monies that he earmarked for the olah, so use them now for an olah purchase. Even though the owner is dead, that doesn't bother us, that doesn't restrict us from using them for an olah purchase. And if one uses the monies for his own benefit, he's guilty of me'ilah. Vashar yiplu l'nedava. The balance, what does the balance represent? It represents shlomim and chatos. You have demei chatos that are mixed in, and as we've seen before, when you have demei chatos mixed in, the monies are used for nedava, for the purchase of public olah sacrifices. Umoalin bohen, and we're following the girsa of the Gra, and there will be a me'ilah possibility. The Gemara continues. Omar Rav Huna, Omar Rav. We continue, but we should point out on the side we have a nosei mivne heading where we feature the diamond. The diamond represents deos b'ma nechshav mefurash uma nechshav sasum. What is considered mefurash and what is considered sasum. And here, as opposed to language, as opposed to terminology, we're going to, which we discussed already, what constitutes mefurish and what constitutes sasum. Here, we're going to refer to items, specific items, and that again might sound a little obscure, but by going into the Gemara, we'll see the actual cases. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav, lo shanu elo mos. This concept of stumin, undefined, would be used for the purchase of nedava. That is true only with regard to cash. Aval behema harei hi kemifureshes. If you have animals that have not been defined, and a person had been a Nazir, he set aside animals in anticipation of them being used for his Nazir sacrifices, we don't say that they are considered sasum. They're considered defined. Truth is that each animal, it's very clear what they would be used for. 3 animals were set aside. Well, the male animal, for example, that will be used for an olah. An olah comes only from male animals. A female animal, that would be used for a chatos. And amongst those 3 animals, there's a ram, a 2-year-old ram, an ayil ben shnei shanim, that is used for a shlomim, even without his having said so explicitly. It is as if it had been specified. Omar Rav Nachman, Ha'ti Amri, Behemo Harei Hi Kimefureshes, that which we just learned, that a behema is as if it has been specified, Lo Shanu Elo Tamima. This is true only with regard to an animal that's blemish-free. Meaning, it itself could be used as a sacrifice. Avol balas mum, harei hi kistuma. Let's say you had those 3 animals with all of the, let's say, very specific signs to them, as we mentioned, but they became blemished. Well, you're not going to use those animals as sacrifices. A sacrifice must come from a blemish-free animal. What happens when you have a Baal Mum? When you have a Baal Mum, you sell the animals and you get cash. And with the cash, you would be expected to buy sacrifices. So these blemished animals represent in our mind's eye cash. And we said before that if you're dealing with cash and it hasn't been defined, Hare Hein Kistuma. They are like the Balas Mum. Animals are like stumen, with all of the halachas that we mentioned earlier. Avol Naska Lo. Naska is a bar of silver. If a person had set aside 3 silver bars, and then he died, those will have the status of mefurashin. Those 3 silver bars were set aside, one for the purchase of a chatas, one for an ola, one for a shlomim. So you will end up taking one of the bars and sending it to the Dead Sea, and using the other 2 bars for the purchase of an ola and the purchase of a shlomim. Continuing in the Gemara, V'Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok Omar afilu naska. Even the case of the 3 bars that he set aside, they will still have the status of stumin. And as we said so many times already, if the owner dies, the Nazir owner dies, you'll take those 3 bars and buy ola sacrifices. Avol savor shel kuros lo, a pile of beams. Those are considered mefurashin. The pile of beams have value, and if you had 3 piles of wood beams, they are considered like mefurashim. We have now a question. As far as explanations for why the Naska or the Savor Shel Kuros would be considered mefurashim, you will see in the different meforshim the explanation for that. But for our purposes, it's all we need to do right now is operate with categories. Now, as the Gemara goes on, we mentioned there is a question. Note that we have a long question. Rav Simi Bar Ashi raises this question, and on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, we're going to be spilling over, as you can see from our Daf Yomi quota, as we mentioned at the beginning of today's shiur. There will be then a response by Rav Papa. As far as that is concerned, I have to tell you ahead of time that there are different approaches taken by the commentaries. We'll be following what seems to be suggested by Rashi, where Rav Papa has a very long response, which will continue till the end of the shiur, the second line from the top of Chof Zayin Amud Beis. So now, first we have Rav Simi raising a question, going to the bottom line, and then Rav Papa's response. Omar Lei Rav Simi Bar Ashi Rav Papa. My Tamayu de Rabbanon. When he refers to the Rabbanon, he's referring to the names we had above with diamonds, the Amoroyim that we had before. He asks, my Tamayu de Rabbanon di Amri Mo'os v'lo behema v'lo naska, that Mo'os alone are considered sosum. They lend themselves to that category of being stumin, and not behema, like Rav said before, or not naska, like Rav Nachman said before. Mo'os v'lo savora. Mo'os are stumin and not beams that we saw in Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Elo me'ato, if you're going to follow this line of thinking that says money, yes, and not other things. So, would you say mo'os v'lo oifos, and not birds? In other words, if you had set aside birds for sacrificial purposes and you didn't define them, they nevertheless would be considered defined. Is that so? And if you say, yeah, that's right, that birds, even without your specifying them, they're automatically specified. And when we speak about birds, think about a chatos and ola, which is standard fare, as we've learned very recently, when it comes to bird offerings. So would you say that birds, by their very being, are considered defined? And by the way, the issue of gender has no applicability to to birds. That's just a side point. So you can't say when you look at a bird, you would know this one is as a chatas and this one as an ola. So would you say that only money has the status of being considered sasum, but birds not? And I emphasize again, even if you didn't define which bird is for the chatas and which bird you're going to use for the ola, it automatically is considered defined. Rav Chisda has a very well-known teaching. Ein hakinin misparshois elo I belekichas bailim I basias kohen. Birds are not labeled unless you do so at the time of lekicha, their purchase, where the owner, the client who needs the sacrifices purchases them, or at the time that the kohen is actually processing them. But besides those specific times, if, let us say, the owner did not specify at the time of purchase which bird he wants for the chatas and which one he wants for the olah, those birds are considered stumin. Why should that be? Ha-mois gemirin law. According to the opinions we saw above, the idea of stumin applies only to money, not to birds. And yet, according to Rav Chisda's teaching, birds also would be considered stumin outside of the called purchase time if they were defined, or at the time that the kohen actually processes them. But otherwise, birds are considered stumin. So this question that Rav Simi Bar Ashi is posing is a question essentially on the opinions we saw before, who limited the possibility of stumin to money and did not include birds in their teachings. Omar Lei. Rav Papa responds to Rav Simi Bar Ashi, and we've marked the Gemara in accordance with Rashi with a long answer marking, which takes us to the second line from the top of Chav Zayin Amud Beis. Before we go into the Gemara text, let us glance at the side where we have a nosei, and we also indicate hemshech, a continuation of what we've been discussing. Teguvas Rav Papa L'divrei Rav Simi. This is Rav Papa's response to Rav Simi. Lafi Rav Papa, according to Api Rashi, Yotzei, what will come out is as follows. But derech klal rak ma'ol stumin. Rav Papa is, we'll say, substantiating the line of thought of the Amoroyim that we had in Diamonds on Chavav Amid Beis. That basically only money is considered stumin. Oifais havu stumin mishum gzeres hakosov. I concede to you that ophos, that birds would be considered stumin because of a scriptural reference. Avol shar kol advarim shuzkarnu havion kimufroshin. But all other things that we've mentioned, each opinion in respectively, but as we saw according to Rav, Baalei Mum would be considered, I should say, behemoths that are tamimim would be considered mufuroshin even though they weren't specified. Rav Nachman Yitzchak will tell you that money is considered stumin, and even bars of silver might be, but other things would not be considered stumin. So, as we've said, Rav Papa is substantiating the idea that the concept of stumin is quite limited, each one according to his opinion. The fact that birds were not mentioned, it's true that birds are considered stumin, but they don't represent a difficulty to any of the opinions mentioned before. Meaning, why didn't they mention birds? Well, because birds are governed by a special pasuk referring to birds. But all the other things that were mentioned would be considered mifurashim. Nei Gemara. Top line of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Omar Lei. Rav Papa says to Rav Simi, Ulitamech, according to you, that you want to say that money as being considered sosum is lav dafka, but all kinds of things could be considered as stumin. In other words, Rav Simi's thrust was by showing that birds also can be considered stumin, even though no one ever made any mention of it. It shows you that everything, unless it's very specifically defined, other things too can be considered stumin. Well, we have a Tanaic source that says, Reb Shimon Omer, Hevi shalosh behemos v'lo piresh. A Nazir brought 3 animals and he didn't specify. He didn't say which animal is used for which sacrifice. We say, Hareuya lechatas tikrav chatas, la'oilo tikrav oilo, l'shlamim tikrav shlamim. That which is fit to be brought as a chatas, it's brought as a chatas. That which is to be brought as an ola, that which is fit to be an ola, is brought as an ola. That which is fit to be a shlamim is brought as a shlamim. What do we see? We see that we refer to behemoths as mefurashis. Well, amai ha'amris behema lav kimefureshes damya. According to you, you said that a behema is not considered specified, and yet we treat it as if it is. Omar lei. Now here, even though it says Omar lei, according to the Rashi approach, it's really Rav Papa who continues speaking here. He says, you raised a question from Oifos. We see the Reb Shimon Leil source with behemoths that would seem to counter what you said. Let it be known as follows. Hassam, in the case of the birds that you asked from, there's a Gzeres HaKosov that explains why they would be considered stumin. It says, V'lokach v'osa Omar Rachmana. Here it's of course a very abbreviated quote, but as we explained earlier, I b'lekichas bailim, I b'asiyas kohen. Birds are defined only at the time of purchase, and if not, they'll be considered stumin until the kohen processes them. Hachanami, so too when it comes to behemoths, you can't possibly say regarding them that they would be like stumin, because we continue at the top of Omid Beis, Mi motzis amris hadein dechatas tikravola. Could you possibly say the animal that is fit to be as a chatos, you would think to bring it as an ola? Even you wouldn't think that. Hacha nekeva, hacha zachar. A chatos is a female animal. So if you have a female animal, it's fit to be brought as a chatos. It couldn't be brought as an ola. An ola is a male animal. So the case of behema is also something that's, we'll say, even though you didn't specify it, you would concede as well that they're considered as if they're specified. And just to review we'll say the thrust of Rav Papa, basically all the examples before of the respective Amoraim, saying that only Mos are considered stumin, possibly adding something else, remain intact. Everything else would be considered mefurash. As far as the birds are concerned, that doesn't represent a kasha. There's a Gzeres HaKosov that governs the birds. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.